The prairie was quiet that evening, the kind of quiet that only comes before something unforgettable. The sky burned orange over miles of dry grass, and a lone cowboy rode slow, his horse kicking up soft clouds of dust. He wasn't a rich man or a famous one, just another worn soul trying to make it through another hard day. His name wasn't known in history books, and maybe it never would be. But what happened that night would be told for generations. The land had been harsh that season, no rain for weeks. The rivers were low, the cattle thin, and even the wind seemed tired. The cowboy had learned to live with hunger, dust, and silence. He trusted only his horse and the stars above. He'd seen trouble before, bandits, storms, and droughts, but nothing could prepare him for what he found that night. As the sun dipped low, he saw something strange by the edge of his pasture. At first he thought it was a coyote or maybe a pile of rags, but when he got closer his heart sank. It was a child, a native boy no more than 8 or 9, curled up in the dirt. His face was thin, his hands trembling, his eyes barely open. He looked like he hadn't eaten in days. The cowboy stopped beside him, unsure what to do. Out here, every decision meant risk. Helping a native child could mean danger. He'd heard the stories, settlers disappearing, raids along the borderlands, vengeance for past wrongs. The land was divided by fear, and one wrong step could cost a life. But when he looked at that boy, lying there half dead, he couldn't ride away. He knelt down, his shadow falling over the child, and said softly, "Hey there, son. You still breathing?" The boy blinked once, slow and weak. The cowboy sighed and looked around, knowing he was alone out there. Then he lifted the boy carefully and set him on his horse. "All right," he muttered, "we'll get you fed. Don't you die on me now." The wind picked up, carrying a chill through the empty land as the cowboy turned toward home. He didn't know that by morning, his simple act of kindness would bring 200 armed warriors to his door. The cowboy's small cabin stood miles from the nearest town, a lonely shape against the fading light. By the time he reached it, the last streaks of sunset were giving way to darkness. He pushed open the old wooden door, the hinges crying out like they always did, and carried the boy inside. The room smelled of smoke, leather, and coffee gone cold. It wasn't much, a table, a bed, a fireplace, but it was home. He laid the child down gently on a blanket near the fire and knelt beside him. The boy's skin was pale beneath the dirt, his lips dry and cracked. The cowboy frowned, wondering how long it had been since he'd eaten anything. He poured some water into a tin cup and held it to the boy's mouth. "Easy now," he said. "Slow sips." The child took a few shaky gulps before falling back, exhausted. The cowboy stared at him for a long time. He didn't know where the boy had come from. Maybe his people had moved through here and left him behind by accident, or maybe something worse had happened. The land had seen its share of cruelty lately, settlers taking what wasn't theirs, natives fighting to protect what was left. It was a hard, divided time, and trust was rare. He pulled a piece of bread from the cupboard, soaked it in milk, and broke it into small bits. "You'll eat soon, boy," he muttered, as if the words could will strength back into the small body. The fire crackled and threw long shadows across the room. Outside, the wind whistled through the cracks in the walls, and every sound made him tense. He'd lived alone for years, but that night the silence felt heavier. When the boy stirred again, he whispered something the cowboy couldn't understand. The words were soft and broken, maybe a name, maybe a prayer. The cowboy wished he could answer, but all he could do was nod and say, "You're safe here, kid, just rest." He sat by the fire for hours, keeping watch. Every few minutes he checked to make sure the boy was breathing. He couldn't shake the feeling that helping him might bring trouble. Out here, word traveled fast, faster than the wind. If anyone found out he was sheltering a native child, there'd be talk, angry talk. But what was he supposed to do? Leave the boy to die? That wasn't something he could live with. Sometime past midnight he stepped outside. The moon hung low and bright, silver light spilling across the empty plains. His horse stood tied by the fence, shifting restlessly. The cowboy ran a hand over its mane, trying to calm both the animal and himself. The night was too still, too quiet. It felt like the kind of silence that came before a storm. He walked to the edge of his property, scanning the darkness. Nothing moved except the tall grass swaying in the wind. Still, he couldn't shake the unease crawling up his spine. Somewhere out there, someone had to be missing that boy. And when they realized where he was, they'd come looking. Inside, the fire had burned low. The boy slept, breathing softly. The cowboy added another log, watching as sparks drifted upward like fireflies. He thought about his own childhood, growing up poor, losing his parents young, learning the hard way that mercy didn't come easy in this world. Maybe that's why he couldn't leave the kid behind. Maybe he saw something of himself in him. The hours dragged on. Every creak of the cabin made him reach for his rifle. He kept it close, leaning against the chair where he sat. The boy murmured in his sleep, and the cowboy found himself whispering words he hadn't said in years, half prayers, half promises. "You'll make it, kid. You just gotta hang on till morning." When the first gray light of dawn touched the horizon, the cowboy stood and stretched. He hadn't slept at all. He walked to the window and looked out, expecting another quiet day on the plains. But the sight that met his eyes made his heart pound. At the far edge of the field, dark shapes moved through the mist, one, then 10, then dozens more. Horsemen, silent, steady, and too many to count at first. The rising sun caught on their spears and rifles, flashing like fire in the distance. He grabbed his gun and stepped onto the porch, his boots crunching on the frost. The riders were closing in fast, 200, maybe more. Warriors dressed in paint and feathers, riding in perfect formation. Their faces were calm, unreadable. The sound of hooves rolled across the land like thunder. The cowboy's throat went dry. He looked back through the open door at the sleeping boy. It didn't take a genius to put it together now. This wasn't just some lost child. This was someone's son, someone important. And he had just taken him in. He stood frozen for a moment, watching as the line of riders came to a halt at the edge of his property. Not one of them spoke. They sat their horses in silence, eyes fixed on him. The leader, a tall man with a proud stance and deep red paint across his face, rode forward slowly. The cowboy felt his grip tighten on the rifle, though he didn't raise it. He wasn't foolish enough to think he could stand against that many men. The leader stopped a few yards away, his horse snorting clouds into the cold air. The man's gaze flicked toward the cabin, then back to the cowboy. For a long moment, neither moved. The only sound was the wind and the faint crackle of the fire inside. The cowboy felt the weight of what was about to happen pressing down on him. Whatever came next would decide whether he lived to see another sunrise. He took a slow breath and stepped down from the porch, his boots sinking slightly into the dirt. "If you've come for the boy," he said quietly, "he's safe. I didn't mean no harm." The leader didn't answer. He just dismounted, landing softly on the ground. His eyes, dark and steady, told the cowboy everything he needed to know. This was no raid, no random gathering. This was something deeper, something personal. The cowboy swallowed hard. The sun broke fully over the horizon, spilling light across the field. It caught on the feathers, the horses, the faces of the warriors standing behind their leader. The air was heavy with tension, but also with something else, something like respect. The cowboy didn't move. The leader took a step closer, eyes still locked on him. The world seemed to hold its breath. The air between them was heavy, as if the land itself had stopped breathing. The cowboy stood still, one hand hovering near his rifle but not touching it. He didn't want to fight. The last thing he wanted was blood on his land. But he could feel it, 200 pairs of eyes watching his every move, every breath, every twitch. The wind had gone quiet. Even the horses seemed to wait. The native leader stood tall and motionless, his expression unreadable. His dark hair was braided with eagle feathers that swayed gently in the morning breeze. His face was lined with red and white paint, the colors striking against the pale light of dawn. He said nothing for a long time. Then finally, in a deep, calm voice, he spoke a few words in his own tongue. The cowboy didn't understand them, but the tone was not full of anger. It was steady, controlled, purposeful. The leader raised one hand, and from behind him, two riders came forward. Between them sat a woman, her long dark hair falling over her shoulders, her eyes sharp and glistening with emotion. She dismounted gracefully and stepped closer, clutching something tightly to her chest. When she reached the cowboy, he realized what she held, a small handmade necklace of bone and beads. She looked up at him, then glanced past him, toward the open door of the cabin. The cowboy turned slightly, just enough to see the small figure of the boy standing in the doorway. The child's eyes were wide, uncertain, but there was no fear now, just recognition. He took a step forward, then another, until he was running across the cold ground straight into the woman's arms. She knelt and pulled him close, whispering words the cowboy couldn't hear. The warriors behind them lowered their heads slightly, a silent sign of relief. The leader watched in silence, his jaw tightening as he took in the sight. It was clear now, the woman was the boy's mother. The cowboy felt his chest loosen a little, though he didn't lower his guard completely. He had no idea what they planned to do next. The leader turned his gaze back to the cowboy. His eyes were deep and piercing, not full of hatred but filled with something far heavier, measure, judgment, thought. Then, to the cowboy's surprise, the man stepped forward, closing the distance between them. He stopped only a few feet away. For a moment neither spoke. The cowboy's hand brushed against his rifle again, more out of instinct than intent. Then the leader spoke, his English broken but clear enough. "You found him," he said, his voice low. "You fed him. You made him live." The cowboy nodded once, his throat dry. "He was out there half dead. I couldn't just ride by." The leader studied him closely. "You know who he is?" The cowboy shook his head. "Just a kid." The leader's gaze softened just slightly. "He is my son." The cowboy blinked, the weight of that sentence sinking in. "Your boy," he repeated quietly. The leader nodded once. "He wandered off during the storm. We searched for days. No tracks, no sign. We thought he gone." His voice broke just a little on that last word, and the cowboy saw, for the first time, the grief that had been hiding behind the paint and pride. "I reckon you found him just in time," the cowboy said. The leader's eyes shifted to the cabin again, where the boy now stood beside his mother. "You saved his spirit. You gave him fire again." He paused, then turned to the warriors behind him. With a low sound, half chant, half command, he lifted his hand. The entire line of horsemen dismounted, each moving with quiet precision. 200 boots hit the ground almost at once. The cowboy tensed. "What's this?" he muttered under his breath. But no one reached for a weapon. The warriors began to walk forward slowly, forming a wide circle around the cabin. Their steps were soft, deliberate. The sound of rustling leather and jingling beads filled the morning air. The leader turned back to the cowboy. "You are alone here." "Been that way for a while," he said. "You have no tribe," the leader said simply, almost as a statement. "Never did," the cowboy replied. The leader nodded slowly, as though understanding something that didn't need words. Then he lifted his voice and spoke to his people in their language. It wasn't angry or loud. It was ceremonial, steady, full of meaning. The cowboy stood there, not understanding the words but feeling the weight of them. When the leader finished, two men stepped forward carrying bundles wrapped in animal hides. They placed them carefully at the cowboy's feet, then stepped back without saying a word. The cowboy looked down and saw what they'd brought: dried meat, pelts, tools, and handmade carvings. Gifts, offerings. He looked back at the leader, confused. "I don't understand." The man met his gaze. "A man who saves a child saves a nation. You showed honor when others would show fear." The cowboy's chest tightened. He'd done what anyone with a heart should have done, but hearing it said like that made his throat ache. He looked down at the gifts, then back at the line of warriors, who now stood with their hands crossed over their chests. The leader stepped closer, his voice quieter now. "Long ago, your people took much from mine. But you gave something back." The cowboy didn't know what to say. Words felt small in a moment like this. The leader extended his hand. The cowboy hesitated for half a second, then reached out and shook it firmly. Their eyes met. Two men who lived on opposite sides of history, standing for a moment in the same light. The boy let go of his mother and walked over, clutching something small in his hand. He looked up at the cowboy, shy but grateful. Then he reached out and placed it in the cowboy's palm, a small carved figure of a horse, rough but carefully made. The cowboy turned it over slowly. "You made this," the boy nodded. "My father taught me." The cowboy swallowed hard. "It's fine work," he said softly. The leader placed a hand on his son's shoulder, pride flickering in his eyes. Then he looked at the cowboy one last time and said, "You will not be forgotten." The cowboy nodded, unsure what else to do. The leader turned, gave a sharp whistle, and the warriors moved as one, mounting their horses in perfect unison. The sound of hooves rose again, echoing across the open land. The cowboy stood there long after they were gone, the carved horse still in his hand, the gifts piled at his feet, and the first real warmth of morning spreading across the plains. He hadn't just saved a boy that night. He'd unknowingly bridged two worlds that rarely met without violence. And though he didn't know it yet, his name would live on in stories whispered around fires for years to come. The cowboy stood in the stillness long after the thunder of hooves faded. The dust they'd stirred hung in the air like a ghost that refused to settle. The land was quiet again, but it wasn't the same silence as before. It was different now, heavier, fuller, alive with something unspoken. The gifts still lay at his feet, bundles wrapped in hide and tied with cord, and the small wooden horse rested in his palm. He turned it over slowly, tracing the carved lines with his thumb. The boy's small fingers had shaped every curve. It wasn't perfect, but it carried the weight of a story he didn't yet understand. He went back inside, the floor creaking under his boots. The fire had burned low, filling the room with a soft amber glow. He set the carved horse on the mantel and poured himself some coffee, though it had gone cold. The cup trembled a little in his hand, not from fear but from the shock of what had just passed. 200 warriors could have ended him without a word, yet they came not for vengeance but for gratitude. He'd seen plenty of strange things out here on the plains, but nothing like that. He sat by the fire and let the quiet wrap around him. The events of the last 2 days replayed in his mind like scenes from a dream. The starving child, the mother's tears, the leader's steady eyes. He wasn't a man who thought much about destiny or miracles, but something about this felt larger than himself. The land had a way of teaching lessons, sometimes in whispers, sometimes with a storm. This one had come with silence and the soft tread of hooves. When the first light of dawn reached the window, the cowboy rose and stepped outside. The sky stretched pale and wide, the air cool and clean after the night's stillness. He looked out toward the horizon where the riders had disappeared. Nothing but empty plains now, golden with morning. He took a slow breath and knelt beside the gifts they'd left. Inside the hides, he found dried meat, hand-carved tools, and a woven blanket with colors that seemed to hold the sunrise itself. The craftsmanship was careful, deliberate, each thread a message, each piece a gesture of respect. He wasn't used to kindness. The frontier didn't give much of it. Most men out here took what they could and thanked no one for it. But as he ran his hands across the woven blanket, he felt something stir deep inside, something he hadn't felt in years, a kind of peace he thought he'd forgotten. He spent the day working, as he always did. Fed the horse, fixed a fence post that had gone crooked, and mended the latch on the barn door. But everything felt changed. Every sound carried farther. Every color seemed sharper. The land that had once felt like an endless burden now looked almost beautiful. Maybe it wasn't the land that had changed at all. Maybe it was him. That afternoon, he saddled his horse and rode out to the river. The air was warm, the sun bright but soft. He rode slow, letting the reins hang loose, his thoughts drifting back to the boy. He wondered what kind of man that child would become. Would he remember the cowboy who gave him food and fire when the world turned its back? Would he carry that memory into his own life, maybe speak of it someday to his people around a fire? The cowboy didn't need to be remembered, but the thought that his small act might live on in stories, well, that felt like more than enough. He stopped by the riverbank where the water ran shallow and clear. He dismounted and crouched down, scooping up a handful to splash over his face. The cold shocked him awake, grounding him in the moment. When he looked up, he saw something glimmering in the mud near the rocks. He reached for it, wiping it clean between his fingers. It was a single eagle feather, smooth and perfect. Maybe it had fallen from one of the warriors. Maybe it was left on purpose. Either way, he knew what it meant: respect, honor, a bond sealed without words. He tucked the feather carefully into his saddlebag and headed back toward the cabin. The sky was already beginning to turn gold again, the long shadows of evening stretching over the hills. He'd lived alone for years, but that night he didn't feel alone. Somewhere out there, a family was whole again because of him. Somewhere a tribe was speaking his name not with anger but with gratitude. As he rode, a distant sound carried on the wind, drums, faint but steady. He turned his head, listening. They came from far to the west, from beyond the ridges. It wasn't a threat, not this time. It was something else. A rhythm, a heartbeat, a message. The cowboy slowed his horse and let the sound wash over him. It rose and fell like the pulse of the earth itself. It felt like a thank you carried across the plains. By the time he reached home, the sun had slipped below the horizon. The fire inside the cabin glowed softly through the window. He dismounted, untied his saddle, and patted his horse's neck. "You did good, old friend," he said quietly. The horse snorted in reply, as if it understood. He stepped inside and looked once more at the small carved horse sitting on the mantel. It caught the firelight, casting a shadow on the wall that seemed almost alive. He smiled faintly and set the eagle feather beside it. Two small things, one from a child, one from a warrior, but together they told a story no book ever could. He poured himself a new cup of coffee and sat down in the same chair by the fire. Outside, the wind began to hum softly through the grass. The rhythm of it matched the distant drums, fading now but still there if you listened closely. For the first time in a long while, the cowboy felt something he hadn't let himself feel in years. Not pride, not relief, something simpler: connection. The understanding that out here under the same wide sky, every life, every act of kindness, left a mark that stretched farther than any man could see. The flames flickered low, and the smell of smoke and dust filled the room. He leaned back in his chair, hat tilted low, and let the warmth sink into his bones. The carved horse and the feather glowed softly in the firelight, silent witnesses to a story the plains would remember long after he was gone. The days that followed passed slower than usual, as if the wind itself had grown thoughtful. The cowboy kept to his routine, fixing fences, tending the horses, patching the roof before the next storm rolled in. Life on the prairie didn't pause for memories. It moved forward with the same steady rhythm. Yet, something deep inside him had shifted. Every sound, every glimmer of light across the dry land seemed to carry a quiet reminder of what had happened. The world felt wider now, like it held something more than just survival. Every evening, as the sun melted into the horizon, he'd find himself looking west, toward the ridges where the riders had come from. He knew they were long gone, but the sight of that open land still filled him with an odd calm. Sometimes he thought he could almost see them in the distance, ghostly silhouettes fading into the golden dust. He wondered if they ever thought about him too. One morning, as he stepped outside to feed the horses, he noticed something strange. There, tied to the fence post, was a small bundle wrapped in deer hide. It hadn't been there the night before. He walked over slowly, his boots crunching in the frost, and untied it. Inside was a handful of dried herbs, a small beaded pouch, and a piece of tanned leather with symbols burned into it. The markings were careful, deliberate, lines and circles that told a story he couldn't read but could somehow feel. He didn't need to understand the language to know what it meant. It was a sign that they hadn't forgotten. He placed the bundle on the mantel beside the wooden horse and the eagle feather. The little collection of tokens had grown into something sacred, something that reminded him of the night when silence turned into peace. He didn't talk about it to anyone. There was no one to tell, but those items spoke for themselves. A few weeks later, he rode into town for supplies. The townsfolk had always kept their distance from him. He wasn't the talkative kind, and most folks liked to keep to their own. But that day, when he walked into the general store, he noticed the way people looked at him, longer than usual, curious but not hostile. The storekeeper, an old man with a thin gray mustache, leaned over the counter. "Heard a story about you," he said. "Something about a band of warriors showing up at your place." The cowboy paused, setting his list of supplies on the counter. "People sure do like to talk," he replied quietly. The storekeeper chuckled. "Well, it ain't every day 200 riders march out of the hills and leave a man standing. Guess that's something worth talking about." The cowboy didn't respond. He paid for his things and turned to leave, but before he reached the door, the old man called out, "You did a good thing, son. Not many would have done what you did." He gave a small nod and stepped outside, the wooden floorboards creaking beneath his boots. The wind met him at the door, carrying the familiar scent of dust and sagebrush. For the first time in years, the air of the town didn't feel so heavy. As he rode back toward his ranch, he passed through the open fields that stretched endlessly under the blue sky. The land seemed softer now, less hostile. He'd spent most of his life thinking the plains were empty, a harsh place that took more than it ever gave. But now he understood that the land wasn't empty at all. It was alive with stories, old and new, whispered through the grass and carried on the wind. He was just one of them. That night, he sat by the fire again, staring at the wooden horse on the mantel. The firelight made it glow as if the little carving had a heartbeat of its own. He reached for it, turning it over in his hands, feeling the grooves made by the boy's small knife. He thought about that child, how fragile he'd looked lying on the dirt, and how strong he'd stood the next morning among his people. The memory made him smile faintly. Outside, coyotes howled in the distance, their cries echoing off the hills. The sound was haunting, but it no longer made him uneasy. It was just another voice in the great song of the prairie. He poured himself a cup of coffee and leaned back, listening to the wind scratch softly against the window. The next morning brought frost that glistened on every blade of grass like shards of glass. As he saddled his horse, something caught his eye again, a small figure standing near the tree line. He tensed at first, instinct kicking in, but then he realized it was just a young boy on horseback. The child wore a thick coat of fur and held something in his hand. The cowboy stayed still as the boy rode closer. When he finally stopped a few feet away, the cowboy recognized him instantly. It was the same boy, the one he had found starving on the plains. The boy had grown a little, his cheeks fuller, his eyes brighter. He didn't speak at first. Instead, he reached out his hand, offering a small object wrapped in cloth. The cowboy took it carefully and unfolded the fabric. Inside was another carving, smoother this time, a figure of a rider and a horse, side by side. The detail was remarkable. The cowboy looked at the boy, unsure what to say. The child smiled softly. "My father said you are part of our story now," he said in careful English. "He said you have a brave heart." The cowboy swallowed, feeling a lump rise in his throat. "You're doing all right then," the boy nodded. "We are strong. We hunt, we move with the seasons. I wanted to bring you this." He didn't wait for thanks. With a small nod, he turned his horse and started back toward the hills, the morning light catching the beads woven into his hair. The cowboy watched him go until he vanished into the distance. Then he looked down at the carving again. Two figures riding side by side. No fear, no distance, no enemy lines between them. He carried it inside and placed it on the mantel next to the first one. The firelight flickered across both carvings, casting long shadows across the cabin walls. The sight of them together felt right, as if the circle had finally closed. That night, as the wind whispered outside, the cowboy sat by the window, the warmth of the fire on his face. The stars were bright, scattered across the sky like sparks from some giant unseen flame. He knew life would go back to its simple rhythm: work, weather, and solitude. But something had changed inside him forever. He'd seen the power of one small act of mercy ripple outward until it reached places he could never go. and though the land would never speak of it aloud, he knew it would remember. The cowboy woke before dawn, the sky still wrapped in shades of blue and gray. The fire in the hearth had gone cold during the night, leaving the cabin in stillness. He sat up slowly, feeling the familiar ache in his shoulders, the kind that came from years of work and wind. The world outside was silent except for the faint rustle of frost-covered grass. He got up, pulled on his boots, and stepped outside. The air bit against his skin, sharp and clean. The plain stretched before him, quiet and endless, painted in silver light. He took a deep breath, the kind that filled his lungs with the chill of morning and steadied his heart. The past weeks had been calm, but his mind had not stopped returning to the same thoughts: the child, the warriors, the gift left on his fence. Those moments had woven themselves into his life like threads he couldn't pull loose. They'd changed how he saw the land, the people, even himself. Once, he thought kindness was a luxury men out here couldn't afford. Now he knew it was the one thing that made survival worth it. He walked down toward the barn, his boots leaving trails in the frost. The horses stirred as he approached, snorting softly, their breath rising like smoke. He fed them, checked the water trough, and brushed the dust off their coats. The routine steadied him. Every small act, every motion, reminded him of his purpose. When you live alone, the work becomes your companion, your rhythm, your prayer. Later that morning, as the sun climbed, he took a ride out to the far ridge. It had been a while since he'd gone that far, but something in him wanted to see the world from that height again. The air was cold, but the light had a warmth to it, gentle and golden. He rode slow, the horses' hooves sinking into the soft dirt. The land rolled out ahead of him, vast and beautiful. No fences, no borders, just space. When he reached the top of the ridge, he stopped and looked out across the horizon. From up there, everything seemed endless. He could see the river cutting a silver line through the valley, the faint smoke of his chimney in the distance. And beyond that, the dark edge of the forest where the warriors had once appeared. The memory was still vivid, the silence, the thundering hooves, the way the earth trembled beneath them. He could almost hear it again, faint and far away, like an echo from another lifetime. He dismounted and sat on a flat rock, taking off his hat to let the breeze touch his face. The wind carried the smell of pine and dust, and somewhere in it, the faint hint of smoke from another fire, not his own. He looked toward the western hills. There, barely visible, was a small plume of smoke curling upward into the sky. It was too distant for detail, but he knew what it meant. Someone was out there, maybe them, maybe another band. He smiled faintly. The land was big enough for all of them. He stayed there a long while, just watching. The world felt balanced in that moment, alive but still, wild but peaceful. A hawk circled overhead, its shadow sweeping over him before vanishing across the ground. He thought about the boy again, about the way he'd smiled that day when he came back with the carving. It had been a look of understanding, one that said more than words ever could. In that look, the cowboy had seen something he hadn't felt in years, a connection, unspoken but real. By the time he rode back, the sun had sunk lower, painting the land in amber light. When he reached the cabin, the shadows had grown long, stretching like fingers across the dirt. He dismounted and paused, glancing toward the horizon one last time before stepping inside. The warmth of the fire met him, soft and familiar. He removed his hat, hung his coat by the door, and stood in the quiet for a moment. On the mantel, the carvings still sat together, the small wooden horse from the boy and the figure of two riders side by side. The eagle feather rested beside them, its edges catching the light. He reached out and ran a finger along it, remembering the moment he'd found it by the river. That feather, that horse, those gifts, they were reminders not of what he'd done, but of what it had meant. In a place where life was hard and unforgiving, compassion had found a way to take root. He poured himself a cup of coffee, still hot from the pot, and settled into his chair by the fire. Outside, the wind began to rise, whistling softly through the cracks in the cabin walls. It wasn't the lonely kind of wind he used to know. It sounded different now, gentler, almost like a voice. The flames flickered, their light dancing across the carvings on the mantel. The shadows looked alive, as if they were telling their own story on the walls. The cowboy leaned back, his gaze fixed on the fire. He thought about how much could change from one simple act, a choice made without thinking, a hand extended when the world said to turn away. That choice had led to everything that came after. The boy had found his family. The tribe had found their peace. And he had found something too, though he couldn't name it exactly. Maybe it was purpose. Maybe it was forgiveness. Maybe just the knowledge that he was capable of more than the world had made him believe. The fire popped, and a small ember drifted upward before fading into ash. The cowboy smiled faintly and took another sip of coffee. The night had settled around him, calm and steady. Outside, the moon began to rise over the plains, spilling pale light across the snow-dusted fields. It glowed on the horse's mane, on the barn roof, on the line of hills beyond. Everything shimmered in that soft, silver light, quiet but full of life. He stood and walked to the door, opening it just enough to feel the cold air on his face. The wind brushed against him, carrying whispers from somewhere far away, voices, drums, laughter maybe. He didn't know if it was real or just his imagination, but it didn't matter. He stood there listening until the sound faded into the night. When he went back inside, the fire had dimmed to glowing embers. He took one last look at the carvings on the mantel, the silent reminders of how one act of kindness had rippled through the world, and added another log to the fire. The flames rose again, warm and steady, painting his face in gold. He sat down, hat resting on his knee, and let the warmth sink in. The night stretched on, quiet and wide, the kind that makes a man feel small and infinite all at once. And in that quiet, he finally let the peace settle in his heart, deeper than words could ever reach.